Welcome back to the Civic Forum. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rory Truex. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics in the School of Public International Affairs at Princeton. The Civic Forum is supposed to be a place where we talk about the bigger picture issues facing our democracy. And today I'm delighted to welcome somebody who is really fighting for democracy in an interesting way. As you know, a lot of these sessions have been focused on academics who are worried. And today we have someone who's a bit of a warrior for democracy. So I hope the tone today is more optimistic. Allow me to introduce her. This is Amanda Litman. Amanda, you might recognize from her work for Run for Something, which recruits and supports young, diverse progressives running for down-ballot office. Run for Something, since launching in 2017, has elected more than 1,500 leaders across nearly 50 states, mostly women and people of color. She's also the president of RFS Civics, Run for Something Civics, which is a nonprofit that works to end the gerontocracy. Amanda has written 2 books, Run for Something, A Real Talk Guide to Fixing the System Yourself, published in 2017, and then a new book about work culture and changing work culture when we're in charge, the next generation's guide to leadership. So thank you, Amanda, for joining us on the Civic Forum.
Thank you for having me.
So Amanda, I've asked you to think a little bit and reflect about your experience working with Run for Something and thinking kind of bigger picture about issues of representation.
Yeah, so Run for Something, for those who are not familiar, give a very brief overview, but I'll get a little more detailed here. We recruit and support young people, so that's specifically folks 40 and under, running for things like state house, state senate, city council, school board. We specifically work with young leaders because young people are wildly underrepresented in government. The average age in the House right now is about 58. The median American is 38, 39. Across the board, our leaders are really old. And this has real dangerous consequences for the outcomes that we are getting in elected leadership. Quite practically, we know diverse teams get better outcomes. Every amount of research gets this on the organizational development side. And generational perspective is part of diversity. And young people are living very different lives than older folks, and they experience and consume information very differently. I think the issue that really illustrates this the best is housing. If you are a 20 or 30 something right now in the housing market, one, you're probably a renter or buying your first home. You're looking at the mortgage rates and interest rates and thinking, how am I ever going to afford this? Or you're seeing your rent climb year over year. The idea of ever owning a home feels out of reach or nearly impossible. That is very different than someone who is, on their 3rd or 4th home or has been in their home for 20 years and is thinking, well, if we build more, the value of my property will go down, or who hasn't rented an apartment in 30 years. It's a very different lived experience. One is not better or worse, but they are different. And we need to have legislators who understand that in order to be able to solve it. So we really think about age as part of this understanding of lived experience that changes legislative priorities and the ways in which young leaders can really bring fresh energy and fresh perspective, especially at this moment when our institutions are so clearly not serving the people they need to be serving.
Well, and I think one thing you've gotten at, which is this idea that like just what political scientists would call descriptive representation really matters, right? So the degree to which Congress looks a little something like the population actually makes a big difference into the terms of the way policies are debated and how much people trust the institution itself. So if Congress doesn't look like the population, people start to distrust the institution itself. And I think one thing you've hinted at is this notion that there's this huge age discrepancy. Can you tell us a little bit more about any data?
If millennials were fully represented in Congress, at last stat I saw, there should be more than 100 of us. I think there's fewer than 30. There is maybe 2 Gen Z members of Congress, maybe. Maxwell Frost was the first when he ran and won a couple of years back. In the Senate, there's exactly 1 senator. I think maybe John Ossoff just turned 40, imminently turned 40. These are bodies that don't reflect the American people. I listed out those stats for all those other government bodies, and it is true across the board. Now, it has changed a lot in the last 8 years, and I think I'm proud that Run for Something has been at the forefront of that change, but we are just at the tipping point of a full-scale generational change in power. And I think that 2026 is going to be a really big moment for that.
Well, and one of the things your organization really focuses on is not thinking, you're not saying run for president or run for
Mm-mm.
Senate or run for Congress. You're saying run for something and focusing on local level office, not just because it's a, a step on the career ladder, but because local office really does matter. It's ground zero for democracy. There's, I think, 500,000 local offices
Mhm.
in this country, something of that magnitude. And so, um, how have you found that particular focus? Is it that the barrier to running feels lower for people? The kind of jump to put their foot in the water is lower for people who are considering?
I think it's a little bit practical and a little bit political. So, on the practical side, you can run for school board or city council or even state legislature without being a full-time candidate and without being a full-time elected official. You can have a job. Not every job is accommodating to it, but many jobs are, and you'd be surprised. I would often describe, especially like the city council or school board, it'll be your full-time hobby outside your full-time job, but it is possible and doable. You don't need to be rich. The last stats I saw was a couple years ago, but still, 75% of school board races cost $1,000 or less, 85% cost $5,000 or less. These are not that expensive. And you're not fronting the money yourself. You're raising it from your network and from your community and asking them to invest in the future of the place you love. Also, quite practically, this is where you get the experience of how to become a politician. Politics is like art or music or sports, and the way that you become an athlete or a musician or an artist is by making or doing the thing. No one is born into this. You become it by doing it. The way you become a candidate for office is by putting your name on the ballot, and you get started at these local levels. So practically, it is the beginning and the entry point. Politically, I would say policy wise, most of the things that affect your day-to-day lived experience are decided on the local level. Things like how easy or hard it is to build a home where you live, how good or bad the schools are, how well teachers are paid, how easy or hard it is to vote or access reproductive health care, climate change issues. So much of this is tackled at the state and local level. And if you aren't engaging there, you are missing a real opportunity to control a lever of power. These offices also, as we're currently seeing, really shape what is possible on the national scale. So, state legislators in many states redraw congressional maps, ideally every decade, although right now we're seeing them try and do so mid-decade. They shape things like voting access, voter ID laws, voter suppression rules, all come from state legislatures. Um, the way to win the big elections is to win the small ones. And the way to win those small ones is with really good people who are community minded and able to do the work. So we think about this both from a practical perspective and a political one. These offices, these really small ones, are where both it all starts and also where it all can end.
Well, and we had a scholar, Kim Lane Shepley, on last week, who is a scholar of Hungary, of all places, and
Mhm.
she was talking a lot about the erosion of democracy in Hungary under Viktor Orban. And at the end of this session, we were talking about how does one reinvigorate democracy? Like, what are we supposed to do in a moment like this? And her answer centered on local politics. That was her answer.
Yeah,
She basically produced the same answer you did, coming from a very different perspective. But noting how like democracy is centered around local relationships, the trust that community builds, civil society, and running for office is a piece of that. And so I think people often are drawn to the national level because that's what's in the news cycle and that's where it seems like the action is at. But in fact, as you said, a lot of the action that really matters for your day to day is in these local bodies.
that's right.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about barriers to representation for people. And in our field, we talk, there's sort of a list of things that people have identified as really important. One, which you alluded to, is time. So
Mhm.
having the time in your day to do this. The other is funding. Elections, as you get higher up, are ludicrously expensive. So time, money, and then the third one is sort of not necessarily credentials, but sort of, I guess we would call it credibility, right? So being taken seriously as a candidate, both by the party that you're of, but then also the voters. And so for your candidates, the people you're working with, which one of those is the one that really is the hang up for them?
It's money more so than anything else. And some of it is their personal finances, where like especially if you're in your 20s or 30s, you're just getting your career started, you're maybe thinking about starting a family, or you have a small kids, and you're thinking about childcare expenses. All of this really affects the ability, flexibility you have outside of work. And it's thinking about the ability to raise the money you need. Again, we know that generationally, the younger you are, the less access to wealth you might have. Your friends, your peer network are also in the beginning of their careers or in their, entry level, mid-level salaries, which means they're also not making tons of money that they can then donate to your campaign. So I think those two things are what we hear from most from candidates that either stops them from running in the first place or that becomes a real barrier to success. Now, both of those are mostly solvable, in part by leveraging the credibility that a candidate can create for themselves. I think one of the challenges is that, especially for internal party actors, they see fundraising as a shortcut to determine success. Like a candidate is viable if they can raise money, but a candidate has to be seen as viable in order to raise money. Both of those things are true, becomes tautological. So we really encourage like our peers and colleagues at other organizations to try and disconnect those. You can be a really good candidate who might not be set up to raise a ton of cash, but if we give you a veneer of credibility, and that's what Run for Something tries to do with our endorsement, is to like say, this is someone worth investing in. This is a great candidate who really understands where their voters are and is putting in the work. Throw some money behind them.
Well, and part of this is also gatekeeping. I live in Philadelphia, which I don't want to mischaracterize it. I'm not deeply involved in Philadelphia politics, but it has the feeling of kind of a machine town.
Mm-hmm.
I would describe it, where it's sort of these political insiders, you either know them or you don't, and the kind of machinations of the Democratic Party in Philly determine who gets those city council seats and nominations. And you see people who are appear to be outside that system and they're interesting candidates, and lo and behold, they don't quite make it through. And so that's another wrinkle in this age story, right? Is what party broker is going to look at a 24-year-old and say, "Yeah, you're the person we're going to put our weight behind." And so again, like maybe that's changing, right? Maybe candidates are able to go directly to the people through social media, like the Mondani model. But again, how are you? How do you encourage people to navigate what we would call party elites, the people who are kind of giving those stamps of approval that are needed to get funding and all those sorts of things?
I think we're at a moment where the party elite doesn't have as much power as it used to. Like the machine, there's some states where this isn't the case, especially some cities where it's not the case. But generally speaking, the machine has more bark and not as much bite as it used to. It doesn't have the juice. The old guard and establishment is so disconnected from where voters are that they can't move people the way they used to. They can't promise or mobilize people in the same way. They also can't really influence funders in the way that they used to. Certainly, like there's some stuff around the margins, but it is no longer a guarantee that if you are the chosen candidate of like the party establishment, you're going to have all of the benefits that used to come with that because they can't deliver them. And I think there are ways in which both that has changed the way that the party operates, and it is also true that there's some benefits to incumbency, like being able to access, more experienced staff because the party tends to know like the right vendors to call to get you the best deals. They can give you access to the voter file at a cheaper rate, things like that. But the establishment is just not that powerful anymore. I think this is a misconception that folks have that like if you're the chosen person, they're going to give you a secret list of donors that you can call. Like they don't have it. They don't.
Well,
It's just
and it's almost they want to. I don't want to speak too generally, but it seems like they want to maintain the perception of power. So they want to maintain this perception of being the gatekeepers, when in reality, it's not like they can just pull votes and swing votes like they claim to, or maybe they could have 30, 40 years ago.
they are bluffing. And if you call their bluff, like most, bullies, they fold because they don't have any meat, like muscle to back it up anymore. I mean, I think the New York primary is maybe the best example of this, but it's not the only one where, the machine was moving behind the scenes for Cuomo over and over again. And, even spent $30 million against Mamdani through super PAC funds. But if you can't actually deliver votes, it doesn't matter.
Well, and we may well be entering the era where the machine mobilizing for you actually, because of this anti-establishment feeling among certain voters, that it's actually a net negative, right? And it turns people off.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think we're going to see that in 2026 in a lot of these, especially Democratic primaries, where the candidate running against the sort of chosen inheritor of the seat is going to have an advantage by saying, like, the establishment wants that guy. Can we trust them?
Hmm. One of the things that your organization gets at in another way is working class representation. And this is, in some sense, you talked about the gerontocracy and sort of the disparity in youth representation. The working class representation is frankly just as bad. So 50% of the American population does manual labor or service of some kind. It's roughly 2 to 4% of Congress has that background. And so we have a Congress of primarily lawyers and business people. This isn't an America only phenomenon. There's been studies in political science that suggest that this is true of many OECD countries, but it is particularly acute here. And what's also interesting is people overestimate how much working class representation there is. So if you ask Americans like on a survey, they would probably estimate around, oh, maybe 20 to 25% of Congress, something
Hmm.
like that magnitude. But the reality is quite low. And so, and again, this is a population that needs representation. And the fundraising barrier is acute. The time barrier, right? So the idea that you could get time off work to go campaign and fundraise, that's another issue for people who are working class and probably lower income. And so this is a really acute issue, I think, for democracy, and it's fueling some of the kind of authoritarian populism we might be seeing in certain parts of the spectrum. So for you all, I mean, how have you, what's your experience been like working with that type of candidate, and what are the kind of unique issues you've seen with those folks?
60% of Run for Something's candidates self-identify as low income, or lower income. It has always been the kind of people we love working with best because they're really in touch with the issues their communities are facing. Um, they understand better than anyone why it matters to have elected leaders fighting for the things they care about. They really bring like some personal vigor to the work. There are, as you talked about, all of the structural challenges that make it so difficult. The cost of running, the time away from work, especially if you have irregular work schedules, it can be very hard to fit in campaigning. And of course, the gatekeepers who will ask, like, how are you going to make this work? They don't believe that you can do it. We have found logistics are hard. I don't want to BS anyone. The logistics are hard, but voters have an appetite for someone who can like call it like they see it and who clearly understands where the priorities should be. I think that has made candidates who come from a working class background really effective communicators.
Well, and that
It
goes
can,
oh, sorry, keep going. What were you
I
gonna
was
say?
gonna say, it's a really powerful way to bring your lived experience into your campaign.
I wanted to talk to you about authenticity. You kind of alluded to this with working class candidates, but that's a theme of what you're trying to do, and certainly a theme of your more recent writing about what you call responsible authenticity. And you might argue that the Democratic Party has a little bit of an authenticity issue, not uniformly. And Donald Trump, for whatever reason, strikes people as authentic, despite being a pathological liar. People believe he's real for some reason. And so tell us a little bit about this concept that you're trying to put out about responsible authenticity, and how you encourage it with your candidates.
Yeah, responsible authenticity is what I write about in When We're in Charge. And it's about this idea that you should not, especially in a leadership role, it's not about being your real self necessarily, or even your full self, but being your best self, which is kind of a hot take here. That doesn't mean don't be true to who you are, but that there is, I think, a misconception that authenticity is like saying whatever dumb thought comes to mind, or being rude or disrespectful, or, in many cases, it's an excuse for bigotry or worse.
Wearing.
That's not the case. Um, your job as a leader or as a candidate is to know who you are, know what you are trying to accomplish, and identify what you need to bring forward of the former in order to get to the latter. So, like, where's the Venn diagram overlap between who you really are and what your goals are to bring to your team? Now, for candidates and for the Democratic Party, our challenge is we have no idea who we are anymore. We cannot be authentic as a party because we don't have a core backbone to or a core like shape to hold. The reason people think Trump is authentic is because, yeah, he's a pathological liar and a narcissist, but that's like really who he is. That is
He's
his
authentically,
he's
well,
authentically a bullshitter, you know? Like he's authentically a bigot, he's
he's
authentically
true to
racist, he's
himself.
authentically a
Yeah.
bullshitter. And well, I'm not interested in that. I do think that is why he appeals to them. And, the thing with Trump in particular is that his shtick does not work for anyone else. We saw this even in the Republican primary in 2024. Ron DeSantis tried to do the same thing and it like does not
It's not.
work.
Yeah.
It smells. It reeks of BS from him. It works for Trump because it is who Trump is, and also because he has 40 years in the public eye of building this brand. Now, Democratic candidates, especially right now, have a chance using, online properties, social media, the internet writ large to speed run through those 30 years of brand building and like I do a couple weeks, months, years of constant exposure online. But they have to do that while they have a really firm shape to hold. And that's the challenge, I think, for candidates now is to identify what is a version of myself that I am bringing forward. And just as important, what are the things that I'm keeping private? And I think this is a challenge in particular for younger leaders who have been overexposed online in many ways, but being really intentional about the parts of themselves they're putting forward for public consumption and the parts that they stay private.
Well, and it is a generational issue. Like to have I'm a geriatric millennial. I don't know where you are, but it's not a great label, but I'm a 1984. So, at the high end of the millennials. And we were the generation that started to have social media. Facebook was invented when we were when I was in college, right? But the younger generations, like this is something they've been exposed to much earlier in life and are just used to that kind of self-presentation. Like, so I'm taking a version of myself and presenting it on Instagram, TikTok, whatever social media platform they're using. And is there a danger that that breeds inauthenticity? So there's almost like what you're trying is to talk about is like this Goldilocks authenticity where you're responsible, you maintain something private, but we don't want to be irresponsibly authentic and we don't want to be inauthentic and phony
Yeah.
and I think one thing for me personally, like I've always find career politicians, I don't gravitate towards them. So if someone's been running for office their whole life and wanted to be president since they were 15 and has lived their life as such, I'm instantly turned off by that kind of person because I feel like they've just been manicuring their image this whole time. But what you're saying is sort of, well, of course you need to manicure your image. So there's like a healthy way to do that. So can you tell us a little bit more about your advice for that?
Yeah. So, I'm 35, so I'm like peak millennial, baby of the
Not
1990s.
geriatric. You got just normal millennial.
Normal millennial, just a high millennial, you might say. I think about like when I was 15 or 16 and I had an AIM profile, my away message. I would very carefully pick what song lyric would I put in my profile and what background in order to tell what story to whatever crush I was hoping would look at my like AOL Instant Messenger. In the same way that now you think about what am I putting in my Instagram grid? What story am I posting? What stories am I resharing? What goes on the group chat? What goes on the grid? What goes on close friends? All of those are iterations of me, but they are iterations of me for different purposes and for different kinds of people's consumption. I think this is the thing where, for if you describe this to someone who's grown up online, even a little bit younger than you, like of course, like the version of me on LinkedIn and the version of me on my group chat is still me. It's a different, serving a different goal. I think that the challenge, and this is what makes leadership in this moment so hard. Like, I don't want to pretend this is easy, but the challenge is trying to have a consistent version of yourself that you can present across these spaces in a way that still feels true and to create space for growth. This is also the tension that I think is coming in particularly right now for younger leaders who like, if you've been posting on Twitter for 12 years, like you really have said some shit you no longer agree with. And it
Yes.
is authentic to grow and change. It is not, it would be inauthentic to like still be believing necessarily the same things you believed when you were 22.
Well,
And
and
that is also one of the hard
and
things that we have coming up right now.
Well, in some sense, that's also more attractive, right? To like, I would rather have the candidate that maybe ran their mouth when they were 18 and said some stuff that they hadn't fully through than the candidate who's been perfectly self-censoring for 20 years in hopes of running for office. You know what I mean? So I think that in some sense, we're having a moment where being imperfect seems to be okay. Um,
Yeah.
like it makes people human, it makes them more accessible. I think we're in a place where we're forgiving candidates for some of these types of things. Like there is no like the perfect candidate in some sense is off-putting in a weird way.
Yeah, you don't want the guy created in a lab,
Sure.
like the beep bop robot. You want the human. I think this is the thing that often political pundits and even operators will lose sight of is people vote for people. We don't vote for tactics. We don't vote for advertising. We don't vote for policy positions, even necessarily, or ideologies. We vote for people. And that package of a person might include positions that they hold, ideologies that they contain, the ways that they tell their story, their advertising. But like, there's a reason that you can vote for someone you don't agree with 100% on every issue because you're voting for them as a person. The way that we consume information now, and we're seeing this in the media space in particular, like it's not via institution, it's via personality. Like there's a reason that media institutions are trying to turn their reporters into creators because we are drawn to personality. We want to know that there's a perspective behind it. That is the same thing that we are seeing in politics. You want to know who the person is and whether or not you can trust them, regardless of their institutional credentials.
In some sense, I mean, I think it's quite kind of a liberating moment, and it's a strange moment because, as you're saying, people are not trusting media institutions anymore, right? So they'd rather get news from a trusted creator, someone they believe in their voice. They don't think they're bought by some institution or something like that. And so it's anybody can be a journalist, anybody can have political influence, anybody can run for office, right? It's sort of and it's open right now in a very unusual way. And I think you're closer to this than anybody, but this idea that there's this sort of floodgates are opening and that sort of young bench of young progressives that's just building out behind the scenes and it's about to explode in the next kind of 2 to 6 years is a very exciting time in politics.
I think so. We've had more than 225,000 people raise their hands to say they want to run in the last 8 years, more than 60,000 of them in the last 9 months.
That's an unbelievable number, by the way.
It
I
is.
don't even know how you manage all of it. That's a lot of people.
It is, and it's a thing we have built the organization to hold, and we've scaled our program intentionally. But we want to make sure that we are democratizing access to information that gatekeepers get kept behind the gate. So things like how to file, how to get on the ballot, how to think about a campaign plan, uh, defining the terms that we use in these things, because it's not rocket science. Running for office, hard work, not that complicated, especially on the local level. It's about building relationships with voters before a deadline. You can do that by literally talking to them. You can do that through ads. You can do that through press. You can do that through social media. Like it's tactics that you use, but ultimately towards the same goal of building a relationship. And I think, to your point, in the next 2 years, we're going to be at the beginning of a generational change, in especially the Democratic Party. In the next six, full sail. You are going to see an entire turnover about who's taking power in this party in a way that I think will be good both for the party, but also for democracy.
Well, part of the issue here, and I would love to hear your thoughts, knowing that my personal audience, for whatever reason, seems to be primarily over the age of 55. I have a special bond with this generation for some reason. But there's also this issue of the gerontocracy and of people kind of needing to make way for the next generation, right? And so it's one thing to have people running for office, but if incumbents aren't leaving seats that matter. And so I guess the question is, how does one encourage sort of graceful exit, making like embracing that change from older people who have worked really hard to get those jobs. They've been there. They believe they have something to continue to contribute. How do you navigate that kind of intergenerational tension?
I think there's structural reasons at play, especially in Congress, why older leaders do not want to give up power. especially on the Democratic side. Up until very recently, there were some real privileges to seniority. The longer you were in office, the more likely you were to be able to access a position of power. Committee chairmanships were held for the people who'd been on that committee and been serving the longest. Now, that has just changed really in the last 5 months, this term. The rules are loosening. Uh, that's a good thing. And we are seeing the consequences of gerontocracy in real time. I think the Biden campaign was the most public example of President Biden was quite clearly not up to the task of running for reelection, um, wouldn't have been up to the task of serving again. And we have now seen in 2025, three Democratic members of Congress die in office, leaving vacancies in their roles, leaving their communities unrepresented for periods of time. Two of them, or at least one in Texas, where the governor has just delayed the special election for nearly a year to fill the seat, leaving a community in Houston without representation. So the gerontocracy, bad with real consequences. Now, how to fix it beyond adjusting those structural realities is to assume that this conversation is not happening in private because no one internally is incentivized to do so. The family of the elected official is not going to, because like imagine how hard it is, or perhaps you've lived it to tell like your parent or your aging grandparent that it's time for them to stop driving.
Yeah, yeah.
What if instead of keys to the car, it's the position and job that you've had for 40 years and you gain all of your identity and self-worth from? Like, there's no easy way to have that conversation with a loved one. Staff will not have it because if they do, they'll lose their job. Like, if the person steps down, then that staff person's out of work. Consultants certainly won't have it. Donors aren't going to have it because they've already invested money and emotional energy and financial resources into this elected official. So we have to have it in public. It is uncomfortable. I have called for every Democrat official over the age of 70 to make this their last term, to retire and create space for a new generation of leaders. And when I did so in an op-ed earlier this year, I had a lot of blowback. But I also got a lot of people really excited to see this conversation breaking through because it is a necessary one that we have to be having. This is not a moment for being gentle with people's feelings. Democracy is crumbling, as you and your other sessions have talked about. Authoritarian is here or nearly here, depending on your perspective. Either way, things feel pretty bad. And if we are not sending our best possible fighters forward, and in this particular moment, that means people who can both understand clearly who our opposition is, who can see clear-eyed that this is not the Republican Party of Trump, or rather, this is not the Republican Party of George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney. It is Trump's party all the way down. They are not good faith partners in governance. They do not want to negotiate the policy details of how we're going to best fight for working families. They want to burn the system to the ground. And we need leaders who can communicate that in a way that really meets people where they are right now. So who understand how the algorithms work, who know how to use social media, who can be responsibly authentic them and be themselves online in a way that makes sense, who understand the attention economy. I'm not saying there aren't older leaders who can't do this well, but you would be hard pressed to identify a single leader over the age of 70 who could not be replaced and be improved upon by someone under that.
Well, and the way I've been thinking about it is our democracy is in danger, and things are quite dark right now, and things are likely going to get worse before they get better. But I think one of the unintended consequences or silver linings of the moment is that it's creating a space for these types of conversations that could ultimately lead to a rejuvenation, kind of a better version of our system. And we look at data, right? We know young people especially are disenchanted with democracy. They're completely shut out and shut down about politics, and young men in particular, which has been a real problem for the Democratic Party. So I think this idea of fostering that turnover and creating that space could reinvigorate representation in politics, and can be really healthy. I want to talk about two more topics, if you're willing. The first is women. We went down the list of underrepresented groups, and we didn't talk about women. Women have, I believe it's 30% of seats in Congress. But if you kind of dive underneath the hood, we were looking at some data before this. There are 7% of people in Congress are women with minor children, meaning kids under the age of 18. There are 24% of representatives are fathers with minor children. So there are dads. There's a fair amount of dads in Congress, but not a lot of moms, basically. It's a long way of putting this, getting to that point. So for women in particular, the kind of different versions of these barriers, especially for young moms, you're a young mother. Um, the idea of finding the time, the space, the energy to launch an ambitious campaign, it requires a certain type of career, a certain type of family structure, a certain type of partner. How have you found working with that type of candidate?
I'm a mom of two girls under three, so forgive me for like
No, it gets
repressing.
easier.
I'm in it at the moment. And so I have deep, deep empathy and awe for the moms who are able to do this. It is incredibly difficult. We have worked with so many young women who have either had little kids or often become parents while they are running for office or while they are serving in a way that is so inspiring. Um, there's a Texas state representative, Erin Sweeter, who, when she ran in 2018 to flip a state house seat, which she ultimately did, she was pregnant during her campaign and she was very sick. And she would go knock doors, throw up on when she was knocking doors on the college campus in UT in Austin, and get mistaken for a student because she was kept puking in the trash cans when she was so ill during her pregnancy. She brought her daughter Lark to the state capitol when she was later sworn in. She's now been one of the representatives who left the state for a period of time to try and fight the redistricting efforts there. And she talks about like she did it for her daughter. She did it because her daughter deserves a better democracy, and she wanted to show her what it looked like to fight. And I've seen
Oh,
these women.
was there a campaign ad around that whole arc? Was that it's a very
I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and it is. I think it gives you a sense of like how personal it is for these women in particular. um, Parents, dads too, and I've loved seeing the dads that Run for Something has worked with over the years fight for structural change to make it easier for other young parents to run and win. Because like these meetings don't have childcare. They're at night. They require you to leave your family and like skip bedtime, put more work onto your partner. It's very, very hard. Many of our candidates across the country have fought for using campaign funds for childcare when you're running for federal office, thanks to the leadership of the folks at Vote Mama and Luba Gretchen Shirley, that is now possible. The FEC has ruled you can use federal campaign funds for childcare, but on the state and local level, it's still being determined jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So things like that can make a big difference. For folks who are maybe watching this and thinking, maybe I want to run, but I don't know how I do it with my family. One of the things Run for Something is able to do is connect you to other people who've been in your shoes and have found ways to do it. So you can learn from people's experience.
well, and one thing we see in our field is a few things. One, voters do not penalize women, right? So voters want female candidates, they want mothers. We also know that women represent their constituents differently. So we know that women are more likely to sponsor bills related to family, healthcare, education. So this goes back to this theme of descriptive representation, right? Who's in Congress matters. What their background is really matters. And what's interesting is that so voters want women. Women perform very well in these positions. The two barriers we see in our field is in terms of data, the studies that have been done on this is one, party leaders often choose men over women. They err on the side of men. And then two, women occasionally do not see themselves as qualified. So the kind of idea of like, oh, I'm not, I can't do this. That's not me. Like that imposter syndrome feeling is gendered as well. And so it's for me, it seems like one thing your organization does so well is it tells people sort of, yes, you can, right? Why not you? That kind of sentiment. And I think that's particularly important for female candidates.
I think that's right. Actually, there's one other challenge that I'm really curious to see how it plays out in the next year and a half. Um, there is not as many ways to signal authenticity as a woman. Like I've been thinking a lot about this as for male candidates. You're seeing the pros that are running for office now. Like they're trying to show themselves like lifting weights. They go on like the Hangout podcast. They talk about sports. Like women can do that, but it is harder for them to signal relatability. and this has been true in, gender studies and celebrity and political environments forever, that like it is harder for a woman to be cool. And I don't really know, I don't have a good observation or takeaway from that, or even like thoughts on how candidates can navigate that. But it's something I'm really closely watching as these women run for, in particular, the Senate candidates, the congressional candidates, the gubernatorial candidates. Like, where do you go in the media space to break through to women or to break through the environment in a way that lets you be yourself while still being a candidate for office?
And attracting all different types of people, right? So being cool simultaneously to female voters and to male voters at the same time. There's been some work done. My friend Dawn Teal, who you should meet at some point, is a political scientist at Johns Hopkins, has done a lot of work on gender. And she has a paper on what she calls the ties that double bind. And
Mhm.
the basic idea in the paper is that actually voters want female candidates with sort of traditional family backgrounds. So
Mhm.
they want candidates that look like the traditional mother, but at the same time, running for office and being kind of high powered cuts against those sort of traditional family roles and everything like that. So it's almost women are put in this impossible conundrum of we want you to run for office, but we also want you to be this amazing mom at the same time. We want you to be the kind of caretaking, not necessarily a traditional housewife, but still. So it's this sort of the impossibility position that women are put in. I think that's what you're hinting at.
Yeah, and there is a challenge, especially for younger women in this moment. Like, how do you know, perform yourself in a way that both reaches male audiences and male voters, but also isn't like too sexualized because you don't want that to be the perception. It's just, I think it's going to get really complicated. And I think it's something that we need to be really attentive to, because what I don't want to happen is in 2028 for there to be no way for us to even consider nominating a woman. Like, we need to be really clear about the structural barriers at play and how we're solving for that, because I think it will be very tempting for people to say, well, we tried a woman twice and it didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
want that to be the case. Like, women should get a fair shot here.
Yeah, and if that's the sentiment, how many cycles are going to happen before the mentality resets? Like, oh, let's give it another 12. Women can wait another 12 to 16 years, right? So I want to be sensitive to your time. I did want to ask you one question, which we often ask a lot of people on this, is thinking a little bit about political change and political reform. You're very close to elections. You're working with candidates at different types of offices all over the country. Um, if you could wave a magic wand, and let's not say that, if you could just push for a political reform, a change in the rules or practices of the democracy of this country, which one would you push for? Is there something you said this is clearly broken? Is it public financing of elections? Is it the frequency of elections? Is there just something you're like, oh God, this isn't quite working for us?
I'll give you two answers. I'll give you two answers. I think we should pay elected officials more. I
Yes.
think becoming an elected official should be as well paying as anything in the private sector, because it will allow more working class people to run and serve, and will disincentivize corruption. I think we should pay elected officials more at every level and pay their staffs more. I'd include that too. I also think we need wild campaign finance reform. I think New York City's elections are actually a really interesting model. They're not perfect, but the spending caps, especially on the hard side for campaigns, combined with the matching funds. So if you're running for municipal office in New York, every dollar up to a certain amount from a New York City resident gets matched 8 to 1, which is really like quite a lot. And if you opt into the public financing program, there's a limit on how much money you can raise and spend in a particular, first in the primary and then in the general. What that does is both for the candidate is allow them to like raise more from grassroots dollars, encourages reaching out to New York City voters, which I think is a good thing. It also quite operationally allows a campaign to budget knowing how much money they're likely to have. Because you can say the max amount I will have is the $8 million that the city allows me to spend. Then you work backwards. Whereas most campaigns sort of have to guess. based on like previous cycles and what they think their fundraising capacity is. And that often means most money comes in towards the end when it's actually could be better spent at the beginning. So you can't really do planning. It's very inefficient. I think thinking more about how to allow for smarter spending um, and more equitable fundraising capacity. Plus, we need to do some reforms so that super PACs can't then go spend $30 million outside the campaign. But those are the places I would start. Money on both sides of the equation.
Well, and then that also theoretically frees up time for like actual representation, right? And there's a lot of writing online these days about how every email you receive from the Democratic Party is basically treating you like an ATM. And
Yep,
that's also a turnoff, right? Where people are feeling like it's so transactional. But that's the reality of our political system, is that these people have to continuously fundraise to stay in office. And that's a huge problem. It's a distraction from the actual job.
that's right.
So we will leave it there. Amanda, you delivered. I wanted an optimistic session filled with a little hope, and you really did it. So thank you for coming, and we really appreciate your time. Um, for those of you who are tuning in next week, we're taking the week off next week, and then the week after, we're going to talk to people who are working at the program called the Bright Line Watch, which is tracking the erosion of democracy over time. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you in a couple weeks.